With that as our introduction, Baruch Hashem. I don't know if anyone has ever noticed this, but almost immediately after Simchas Torah, what starts to appear in the markets here in Israel? Sufganiyot, okay? Donuts. Now, there is an idea in halacha that 30 days before a pending Chag or a pending Tkufa date on the Jewish calendar, we begin to prepare for that day. So we are certainly not quite, we're about a week early for 30 days before Chanukah, but we are 2 weeks before Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which means that Rosh Chodesh Kislev certainly would be within the 30-day zone. So that's the first idea, that we're not so far off from those 30 days before Chanukah, but it's really no coincidence, we're going to learn together today, that donuts start to appear in the market almost immediately after Simchas Torah, or maybe a week or two after, because we're going to explore together this morning is the backstory of many of the Chanukah, our most familiar Chanukah minhagim and practices and customs, from Hadlakat Nero, from lighting candles, to spinning a dreidel, to eating donuts, okay? So we're going to take a look at these practices, and we're going to jump right in, because I want to make sure we cover everything. We're going to begin with what I'll call the backstory of the Nes Pach HaShemen. Now, believe it or not, the backstory of the Nes Pach HaShemen actually begins not with the story of the Chashmonayim itself, but we're going to go all the way back to the time of Noach. Okay? And if that's the case, as we're going to see together, and you're going to see why in a moment, if that's the case, so maybe it's not so crazy that donuts start to appear already, okay, as we're preparing for Shabbos Parshas Noach. Because as we're going to see together in a few moments, the story of Noach is actually connected, is actually the backstory, if you will, to the Nes Pach HaShemen. So let's just jump right in. We're going to begin with the psukim. Everyone knows the story of Noach. Hashem instructs him to build a teva. He goes on the teva. This is text number 1 on our sheets. He sends out first, when the rain stops, when the flood stops, he sends out first a raven, okay? And then he sends out the Yonah. The Yonah comes back with what? An alei zayit in his mouth. Okay, and an olive's branch in his mouth. Okay, so the Medrash, we're going to jump to the Medrash Tanchuma text number 2. Okay, in the middle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down. Dugma shalcha doma liyona ketzad. The Jewish people are likened to what? The Yonah. And now we're going to jump a little bit further. Okay, va'achar kach shalach et hayona v'tavoy lav hayona. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ma hayona havia ora la'olam. Just as that Yonah represents what? A cessation of the flood and the sun, so to speak, coming back out in the world, light returning to the world. Af atem shenim shalim k'Yonah heviu shemen zayit v'adliku lefanai et haner. You who are likened to the Yonah will also one day kindle shemen zayit, okay, olive oil, and you'll light a candle and you'll bring light to the world. Okay, so what is this medrash referring to? What is this medrash alluding to? So we're gonna now jump ahead a few parshios in Sefer Bereshis. Okay, here's a source sheet. We're now gonna jump ahead a few parshios in Sefer Bereshis to the story of Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu is about to have his second dream. And what happens when he's about to have his second dream? The pasuk tells us, Vivater Yaakov livado. Yaakov is left alone. And that's very perplexing because what? Yaakov is traveling with an entourage of 400 people, and all of a sudden, before he goes to sleep, and before he has that famous dream where he wrestles with the mysterious Ish, right? We're told Yaakov is left alone. And the famous Rashi, Vivater Yaakov levado, why was he left alone? Shakach pani katanim v'chazar alehem. He forgot little jars, and he went back to get them. It's very interesting. Rabbeinu Bechaya, contemporary of Rashi, not on your sheets, but Rabbeinu Bechaya says the word livado, he says, Al tikra livado, ele lichado. Don't read that he was left alone. Rather, he was left with one cod, one specific jar. So Rashi tells us he was alone. Why? Because he separated himself from his encampment to go retrieve jars, small jars that he had forgotten. And Rabbi Bachaya takes it a step further and says, no, it's not just that he retrieved small jars. There was one specific small jar that he intended to go and find. So what was that small jar? So there is a 17-page essay written by the Rebbe of Zhikov, the Imre Noam of Zhikov, that I've condensed and summarized in 2 paragraphs here. And this is text number 4 on our sheets. And get ready to have our heads turned upside down. Okay? The olives from the branch that Noach received from the dove were made into pure olive oil. The oil was given to Noach's firstborn, Shem. Shem, otherwise known as Melchizedek, the priest of the exalted God. Okay? Melchizedek sealed this little jar of oil and gave it to Avraham as a gift. Avraham, in turn, handed it over to Yitzchak, who passed it down to Yaakov. Now, why is this important? He says that there was a jar of oil that was made from those olives that were on the branch that the Yonah brought back. And the Medrash tells us what? That Yonah is a dugma, is a remez that the Jewish people will one day also kindle Shem and Zayit and bring light into the world. Okay? And on top of that, we're told that Shem is, okay, and this is from other Midrashei Chazal, that Melchizedek is actually Shem, okay? And Melchizedek is called a Kohen Le'elyon. Now that expression, Kohen Le'elyon, what does that sound similar to? The expression Kohen Gadol. Okay? And now before we continue with the Medrash, we know that the backstory of the Nes Pach HaShemin is that the Chashmonaim search high and low, and they find only one jar of oil with the insignia of the Kohen Gadol. And there's a famous question that could be asked about that Gemara. That's the story of Chanukah that we know. But what's the obvious question to be asked about the Gemara? Nowhere in all of Hilchos Beis Bechira, the Rambam, does it suggest that the Kohanim were responsible to put a little OU insignia on every jar of oil. Okay? So what is the message? And not only that, who are the Chashmonaim? They're the children of the Kohen Gadol. So it doesn't mean they had to search high and low. If anyone would know where there would be a stash of Shem and Zayit put away safely, tucked away, it should be whom? The Chashmonaim. If indeed that jar of oil was sealed with the insignia of their father, the Kohen Gadol, then they wouldn't have to search for it. They know where it was. And taking it a step further, nowhere in the annals of halacha does it say that the shemen that was used to kindle the menorah needed to have the oil that was sealed with the Kohen Gadol. So what is that idea all about? Right. And then the famous answer of the Beis Yosef, okay, is that in an environment where there's complete impurity, the minute they would have broken that jar open, what would happen to that jar? All the shemen would become tameh. But in such a circumstance, for the greater needs of reestablishing the avoda, at least of the kindling of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, it was permissible in such circumstances, in such extenuating circumstances. Okay, so now listen to what the Rebbe of Zhikov does with all this. According to our sages, Yaakov forgot some small jars on the other side of the Yabok River and returned to retrieve them. One of these jars was the oil from Noah's Ark. Yaakov prophetically hid this oil at the site of the Beit HaMikdash and laid the foundations to the miracle of Chanukah. This is the oil that originated with the dove, the symbol of peace, and continues to shine until Mashiach arrives. The oil that was sealed with the insignia of a high priest was the oil that was sealed by whom? By Shem, who is also known as Melchizedek, who the Torah tells us was a high priest unto God. He sealed this jar of oil away and passed it on to Avram Avinu when he has an exchange of gifts with Avram Avinu Melchizedek. Okay, we just read this 2 weeks ago. Last week we read when they have exchanged gifts. And one of those gifts that was given to Avram was this jar of oil. It's this jar of oil, based on the Rabbeinu Bachaya, okay, that when Yaakov was left alone, he goes back to get this specific jar of oil that he inherited because he's come to the Makam HaMikdash and he has a prophetic vision, says the Rebbe Zhikov, that he has to place this jar of oil at this very spot before he goes to sleep. And it's that jar of oil that the Chashmonaim will find and ultimately light. So the Rebbe doesn't end there because how does he end? I didn't put it on the sheet. He goes on, the remes to all this, the proof text, all this, is Noach's name is Nun Ches. Okay? Nun Chet, right? Oh, sorry, I wrote this here in the notes. Nun Chet obviously stands for either Ner Chanukah or Nes Chanukah. Okay? So the very name Noach is a remez to this crazy story. Okay? So you could take these midrashim, with a grain of salt. I'm not saying this is absolutely the fact or the absolute trajectory. It's just an interesting approach to the backstory, and also might answer why culturally, just as a side note with a smile, why the donuts start appearing already, okay, before Parshas Noach, okay? It's not a coincidence. Hashem orchestrates everything. Okay. With that as an introduction, I want to talk a little bit more about donuts now. Okay? We know that when we eat a donut, unlike when we wash and say Amotzi and we bench and we say the full Birkas Hamazon, we recall Yerushalayim, okay? But we don't recall the Beis HaMikdash in as great a detail as we do in the Al HaMichya Bracha. The Al HaMichya Bracha, we recall both the Beis HaMikdash we recall that there was a Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash, okay? So what happens in the story of the Chashmonaim? They come back to the Beis HaMikdash, they restore the Beis HaMikdash, but are they able to bring karbanos right away? Bring karbanot. Are they able to bring sacrifice right away? No, they have to wait a whole year. Why do they wait a whole year? Because the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash had been rendered tameh. And it took them an entire year, again, because of the way that the Mizbeach has to be constructed. The stones have to be carved a certain way. It took them an entire year to be able to do what? Chanukah HaMizbeach, to reestablish the Mizbeach. So every time we eat a donut, by this is based on the Torah of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, every time we eat a donut, we say the bracha of Al HaMichya. And Al HaMichya, unlike the Birkas Hamazon, we say these words. We want to recall the Al Mizbechacha, the Al Yichalecha. We recall both the Mizbeach as well as the Beis HaMikdash. Not just recalling that there was a Yerushalayim and asking Hashem to rebuild Yerushalayim, but specifically we recall there was a Beis HaMikdash and there was a Mizbeach. And therefore, every time we eat a donut, unlike when we bench, okay, we're reminded what? That the real story of Chanukah is not simply the menorah, but it's what? The reestablishment of the Beis HaMikdash in its entirety, and most specifically, that it took us a year to experience the true Chanukah of the Chanukah HaMizbeach, okay, the rededication of the Mizbeach, and the capacity to once again restore the entire sacrificial rites. That took us a year to reestablish. We'll take questions at the end, okay? So, if you take a look, just summarize, again, this is a summary of Rav Shlomo Zalman, okay? Rav Shlomo Zalman said the Gemara mentions, this is text number 7, that after the war with the Greeks, the Chashmonaim entered the defiled temple and attempted to purify all the holy vessels. They were successful in purifying everything except for the stones that made up the Mizbeach. Distressed by the situation, they buried those stones underground. As such, we should specifically eat sufganiyot, which are fried dough, and whose eating mandates the recitation of Al HaMichya, in order to recall both the korban mincha, the offering of grain and oil, and the Mizbeach itself during Chanukah. Okay, we eat donuts not only to recite the Al HaMichya bracha, which recalls what? The story of the rededication of the Mizbeach, but also to remind us of one of those karbanos that we were not able to be brought, was the korban mincha, which was comprised of flour, grain, and oil, which is basically, today we do a lot more than that in terms of our donuts, but the basic recipe for a donut is you take flour and you make dough with it and you fry it in oil. And so the idea of the donut is twofold, says Rav Shlomo Zalman. Number one is to remind us that during that period for over a year, they were not able to bring any karbanos, including the korban mincha. And number two, to remind us what? Why weren't they able to bring those karbanos? Because there was no mizbeach. And therefore, Chanukah is a celebration of a restoration not only of the menorah, but most specifically of the Mizbeach, which took a year to happen, that we were once again able to bring the various karbanos, including the korban mincha, and all that, says Rav Shlomo Zalman, is represented by the minhag to eat donuts. Okay, so far, we talked about, for those that have joined us as we progressed, so far we talked about how the donuts appear already in our marketplaces here in Israel. It seems like right after Simchas Torah. Really, it's no coincidence, as we discussed, that the backstory of the Nes Pach Hashemin is linked to the story of Noach, and Noach's name, Nun Chet, corresponds to the words Nes Chanukah or Ner Chanukah. So really, it's not so crazy that the donuts start to appear already before Parshas Noach we discussed. And then we discussed the backstory of the donuts themselves and the significance of eating donuts. I'm sorry for those of us that, Ashkenazim from Chutz La'aretz that grew up eating latkes. Okay, latkes, potatoes do not factor into the equation of the karbanos. So donuts kind of trump latkes here. Our family were more latkes people, but okay. What? We know it's the oil, but I'm saying, but here, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman says, no, it's not just the oil. Okay, it's more than just the oil. And that's an important message, okay? That we're not just commemorating the Nes Pach Hashemin, especially since we discussed in the introduction, that maybe that Nes Pach Hashemin, and we'll talk about in the end, that maybe that Nes Pach Hashemin was unnecessary. We could have used any oil in such circumstances. And we also said that really, that nowhere in Halacha does it say that the Kohanim were responsible to kind of seal that jar of oil. So what does it mean that there was a miracle jar of oil that appeared with the insignia of the Kohen Gadol? We talked about the Rabbi Jiko's answer in terms of it being from the shemen from the Yonah, that the Yonah brings the zaytin back to. By the way, anyone who's ever watched one of these cooking programs on like the Food Network, you'll see. I did a little bit of research here, a little bit of R&D. Aged olive oil burns longer. The older the oil is, the longer its staying power. So maybe it's not such a far-fetched idea that the Rebbe Zhikov introduces, that this oil that was hundreds of years old, okay, was the oil that had the miraculous capacity. Okay, but we're going to talk. By the way, we're going to come back to this question of whether the oil being sealed with the insignia of the Kohen Gadol was necessary, or what the significance of it was. We're going to come back to that question in a little bit. But now I want to move on to another well-known custom associated with Chanukah, and that's the custom to spin a dreidel. Okay, and we tend to think of dreidel. If I were to ask most people here, what's the significance of spinning a dreidel? It's the famous story that we were told is that during the Gezerah against chinuch, against teaching children, during the times that the Assyrian Greeks took control of Eretz Israel, there was a Gezerah, a decree against teaching children Torah. So groups, mechanchim would go out in groups with children, and they would teach them in the forest, and they would have these little toys that they would pull out of their pockets if they saw a Greek soldier approaching. So it would appear that this was a play group and not a group learning Torah. That's the story, the apocryphal story of why we play dreidel that I've learned since I was a kid. We're now going to learn from 3 Hasidic masters that are going to give us a very different understanding of the significance of why we spin the dreidel on Chanukah. So let's start with text number 8. We're going to start with Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Rabbi Nachman in Sichas Haran says, "V'zeh b'chinat mashim mischakikim b'Chanukah b'dreidel." What is the idea of why we play with the dreidel on Chanukah? Ki Chanukah hu b'chinat habit hamikdash. Chanukah is all about what? The Beis Hamikdash, as Rav Shlomo Zalman alluded to earlier. It's not just about the menorah; it's about the whole enterprise, right? Ikar binyan Beis Hamikdash, he b'chinan iskar le'el, b'chinat galgel hachozer. The idea of the Beis Hamikdash is the idea compared to a spinning wheel, and he's going to explain this. Ki b'Beit Hamikdash haya b'chinat elyonim lemata v'tachtonim lemala. What happened in the Beis Hamikdash? There was a miracle that happened in the Beis Hamikdash. The worlds blended together. The heavens came down to earth, and the earthly was elevated to the heavens. That's the idea of karbanos, right? We're offering karbanos, something earthly, to have impact in the heavens. So the idea of the Beis Hamikdash, says Rabbi Nachman, is this blending together of worlds, of realms, the heavenly coming down to earth, and the earthly being elevated to the heavens. And he says this is what's being represented by the dreidel. He says the Beis Hamikdash represents this idea of blending the heavens and earth together. It's a beautiful idea. And he says that's what we're doing when we spin the dreidel. The dreidel is about what? Reminding us that just like the donuts remind us there was a Beis HaMikdash, the dreidel reminds us what? What's Chanukah really all about? Sadly, it's not about latkes, it's about what? The Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Now, we're now going to listen. Rav Shagar takes us Rav Shagar, quoting the Baal Tanya, takes us a stage further. Take a look at text number 9. V'shuv milshono ha'admor hazaken b'drashatan l'Chanukah. He says, now let's return to the words of the Admor hazaken, the Baal Tanya, in his drashos on Chanukah. Shamayim va'aretz, heaven and earth, Ruchaniyot v'gashmiyot, spirituality and physicality, hakol shaveh lefanav yibarach, hashoveh meshaveh katan v'gadol. Oh, so the Baal Tanya says something, he takes it a step further. It's not just about representing the Beis HaMikdash, where heaven and earth blended together. It represents the reality of our human perspective. Our human perspective is what? That we exist in a realm of pirud, where we see a differentiation between one another, between us and the heavens, but in the perspective of Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's ultimate oneness. Everything is blended together as one. And Chanukah, therefore, and the Beis HaMikdash was a place, says the Baal Tanya, where Jews could experience that heightened consciousness of seeing that blending together of everything coming together in one great oneness. Beis HaMikdash would nosei ha'afchim. The Beis HaMikdash was what? A reality of paradoxes. Okay? Kilomar, makom asher choshef et choser ha'adel ben chomer leruach. A place where it was lacking, okay, the differentiation between physical and spiritual. Ben Adam Lamalach, between a human and an angel. Ben Mata Lamala, between earth and heavens. Have Delim im yeshnam hem b'chinatenu. Okay, if there are differentiations, if there's pirud, if there's separation, okay, that's because of what? Our limited human perspective. They exist as a result of what? Our reality, the reality that we exist within. But from the ultimate perspective, meaning what? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's perspective, there is no separation. And this is what we learn when we play with a dreidel on Chanukah. Hasivivam mistovev sachor v'sachor. The sivivam, the dreidel, spins round and round and round. V'nofel pam al tzad zeh v'pam al tzad acher. That sometimes it falls on one side and represents one perspective, and sometimes it falls on another side and shows us another perspective. Chanukah is about getting back to this headspace of the experience of being the Beis HaMikdash. Again, everything is back to the Beis HaMikdash. Chanukah is about getting back to the headspace of experiencing the Beis HaMikdash, where that reality of the paradox of our existence became clear to us, where we understood that in reality, there's something beyond our human perspective, and we could experience that through the miracles that took place in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, we'll take questions at the end, okay? Just because I want to keep the flow. So, Reb Pinchas of Koretz, one of the early Hasidic masters, a Talmud Mufak of the Baal Shem Tov, just look what he says here in text number 10. He says, "Kevan sheminhag Yisrael TORAH kashem sheyesh shivim panim leTorah, kachi shivim panim leminhagim." He says the customs of the Jewish people, our Chazal call it, are likened to Torah, and just as we say there's 70 faces to the Torah, there are 70 faces to each of our minhagim, each of our practices. And therefore, he's going to explain what are the 70 faces of the practice of playing dreidel. V'nira li remez lazeh, al pi divrei Rav Zichron Livracha, he's quoting the Baal Shem Tov, shekol anisim ba'im meheichal Mashiach. All the miracles that come into our lives, they all come from the same space in reality of what? That the Mashiach is going to emanate from. In other words, every miracle we experience is bringing us closer to Mashiach Tzidkeinu. Okay? And therefore, he says, V'gam b'Chanukah yored or shel Mashiach. And therefore, in Chanukah, the light of Mashiach comes down. And he says, that's why the dreidel has the letters it has on it. Shaldal otiyot b'gematria Mashiach. The 4 letters on the side of the dreidel equal Mashiach. By the way, that's not true. I'll tell you why it's not true, and we're going to discuss this for a moment. Why isn't it true? Because if you look at the letters Nes Gadol Haya Sham, it does not equal Mashiach. If you look at the letters Nes Gadol Haya Po, it does equal Mashiach. Okay, right? The dreidels that we grew up with in Chutz La'aretz, our dreidels have a shin on instead of a pei, and therefore, if you do the calculation, it doesn't correspond to the numerical value of Mashiach. So but if you take the dreidels of Eretz Yisrael and put a pei, afuch. I'm sorry. It's afuch, it's the opposite. The dreidels we grew up with the shin, does equal Mashiach. If you put a pei here, then what happens? What? It doesn't equal Mashiach. So there's a famous story, actually, of the Belzer Rebbe, Aaron Rokach, when he came on Aliyah in 1951, I believe. He set the shamash all around looking for a dreidel that had a shin instead of a pei, because most of the dreidels here had a pei. But because he understood that the significance of the dreidel was that it had to correspond to the numerical value of Mashiach, okay? And it's about reminding us that it's not just enough to want a Beis HaMikdash, we want to have what? Mashiach. And therefore, spinning the dreidel is about reminding us about longing for Mashiach. He wanted a dreidel that specifically had a shin on it, not a pei, and he sent this gabbai all over Israel to find an old school dreidel from Chutz La'aretz that still had a shin. Today, they're manufactured. You see both here, but the significance of the shin is not just Nes Gadol Haya Sham. It's a reference to Mashiach. The gematria has to add up to Mashiach. Okay. Having said all that, Rabbi Moshe Wolfson, not on your sheets, Rabbi Moshe Wolfson says that the very word Chanukah also corresponds to the gematria of Mashiach. I didn't do the gematria myself. And he also says that Chanukah is Chet Kohen. 8 days, every single one of us becomes a Kohen. So why is that significant? What's the role of a Kohen? The role of a Kohen is what? To bring light, to light the menorah, to bring light into the world. And it's very interesting. We talked about in the onset the problematic question with the famous story of Chanukah. The problematic question of the famous story of Chanukah, that seemingly nowhere in the annals of halakhic literature were the Kohanim told to seal the jar of oil that was going to be used to light the lights. And we talked about how that was not even necessary in the Metzias, in the reality of the Beis HaMikdash being completely impure, that they searched for it high and low. And we also talked about how could it be that the Chashmonaim, who themselves are Kohanim, didn't know where that jar was hidden, that they had to go searching for it. So, says Rav Kook. Rav Kook suggests, and we're going to learn another piece of Rav Kook in a moment, but Rav Kook suggests that Nes Pach HaShemen could be seen as something being allegorical. And he says the most beautiful idea. He says that every single Jew has within them a proverbial pure jar of oil, the pintalayid, the neshama. He says that neshama is what? Is sealed with the insignia of the ultimate Kohen Gadol, meaning whom? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says that's the jar of oil that the Greeks could never render impure. And as a matter of fact, the word Hashemen, is the same letters as the word what? Neshama. Neshama, says Rav Kook. So Rav Kook says that the whole idea of the Nes Pach HaShemen is about the restoration, the rekindling, if you will, of the hearts of every single Jew, to reconnect with the Pintalayit, to reconnect with the spark of divinity innate within the heart of every single Jew. That the story, at face value, doesn't make sense, but it's all allegorical, says Rav Kook. Rav Kook in Ein Hayah says that this story is meant to teach us what? That the Chashmonaim saw the assimilation around them. They saw the darkness that was coming into the world as a result of the Jewish people turning away from Torah. And the Chashmonaim stepped into that void, and they did everything they could to restore the spark within every single Jew. When they searched high and low, they searched high and low, meaning they reached out to every single Jew to remind them what Jewish life is really all about. Let's restore the Beis HaMikdash together. Let's bring back the Karbanos together. Let's rekindle the menorah together. Let's rekindle the proverbial menorah within each and every one of our hearts. And that, says Rav Kook, is the idea of the Nes Pach Hashemen. Hashemen is the Otiot Neshama. Okay. So why is all this important? We mentioned a moment ago that Chanukah is all about Mashiach. And the vision for Mashiach, of course, is a time where there'll be not only achdus and unity amongst Klal Yisrael, but what? That there'll be shalom and achdus within the entire world. So Rav Kook, in this beautiful piece here, the summary of a much longer piece, is going to bring all this together, okay? This is text number 12. The lights of Chanukah are a metaphor for the blessings of enlightenment that the Jewish people bestowed to the world. All of the nation's potential spiritual gifts are included in the dedication of Chanukah. Torah and wisdom, prophecy and morality, justice and compassion, and so on. Like the Beis Hamikdash itself, these are qualities inherent in the people of Israel. So the word Chanukah is appropriate to dedicate the proverbial temple within ourselves. The Zohar HaKadosh tells us what? That every single bar nash, every single human being is a microcosmic world. Okay? Which means that everything that exists in the physical world exists metaphysically, microcosmically, within the hearts of every single human being. And therefore, there's an idea of restoring the Beis Hamikdash in the physical world, in the world around us. There's also an idea of what? Of rededicating the proverbial Beis Hamikdash that exists within every single one of our hearts. Sometimes divisions can lead to internal strife. Those who stress one particular idea may look upon those who promote other ideals as detracting from a more important value. In truth, when each individual advances that light that corresponds to the inner makeup of his soul, the entire people of Israel is enriched. But these conflicts will not exist forever. As long as there is strife and dissension, holiness cannot be properly established. In the future, it will become clear that all the different lights share a common root and are really one single light. Therefore, the blessing of Chanukah, which encompasses the future potential, speaks of a single Chanukah light, lahadlik ner Chanukah. We don't say lahadlik nerot Chanukah, we say lahadlik ner Chanukah, because Chanukah, in its essence, is about what? Returning to this idea, this essential idea represented by the Beis Hamikdash, represented by Mashiach Tzidkenu, this idea of what? Of ultimate achdus. Achdus amongst Klal Yisrael, achdus in terms of coming closer to the great achdus, what Rav Kook calls the achdus hakaleles, which is divinity, which is Hashem's presence in everything. And as we discussed, based on Rabbi Nachman, the reason why we spin the dreidel and the Admor is like, hey, why we spin the dreidel is to remind us of that experience, that clarity that we felt when we were in the Beis Hamikdash, where those worlds collided, where we experienced that paradox of being elevated from our limited human perspective and consciousness to see what? To see that great unity. So Chanukah is not just about a restoration of the light of the physical menorah. It's not just about the restoration even of the Mizbeach, even though it's a beautiful idea that Rosh Shlomo Zalman shared with us, and we all love our donuts. But it's about what? A restoration of a heightened consciousness, of a desire, a longing for Mashiach, a longing for that achdus that was represented by the Beis Hamikdash, and that great achdus that, please God, we'll experience once again, as Rav Kook says so eloquently and so beautifully, that we'll experience once again, please God, with the Binyan Beis Hamikdash and with greeting Mashiach Tzidkenu. Any questions? Yes.
Beautiful that connects to this.
Sure.
Nun Gimel Hey Shin. Nun Neshama Gimel Guf.
Yeah.
Hey Hakol. The Shin Seicha. So it's the four Goliot that we are spinning. And what is the spin? The two from Yechezkel, when you combined Yosef and Yehuda, B'nai Rachel, B'nai Leah.
Families coming together, right?
Together.
A Shvatim coming together.
You have the Nun Neshama was Babel, the Gimel Guf, when Haman wanted to destroy our bodies. Hey Hakol, that's Romy now. And Seichel is
The Greeks.
Seichel, I wrote it down.
Seichel is the
Babel.
Babel. Okay. Yafa? Yes, Brenda.
I heard many years ago a beautiful drasha by Rabbi Isaac Bernstein, the father of Rabbi
Sure.
Bernstein, about why they needed tahar oil, even though, right? Because when you start something new again, it has to be with TORAH. That's why, for instance, Nadav and Avihu, when they died, their brothers couldn't take them out. The cousins had to take them out because the brothers had to stay.
Yafa, yafa.
It's a whole thing.
Yafa, beautiful. Beautiful. Yafa. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Why does a dreidel of the shin symbolize Mashiach?
If you add together the numerical values of the letters, Nes, Nun, Gimel, Shin, and Hey, it comes out to what we say 358. 358, which corresponds to the word Mashiach. Okay?
I made a mistake. Seichel is Yovan.
Yeah, it's Yavin, that's what I'm saying.
Right.
Our story, that's what I'm saying. Right, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
My wife suggested that maybe you can make the latkes the matzah meal.
First of all, not in my house that doesn't happen because my wife is gluten free, but it's a cute idea. I will tell you, again, none of these midrashim obviously are meant to be taken literally. Okay, any Rav Tzadok Khan, I think we've discussed, those of us that have learned together in the past, when we looked at Agadah together, we said in the name of Rav Tzadok Khan, he's very clear about this, that Agadah are not necessarily meant to be taken literally. When we see that famous medrash that Avram Avinu was 3 years old, okay, I know that I'm going to tie this back to the Rambam because this is normally a Rambam class. Okay, the famous medrash that Avram Avinu started breaking down his father's idols when he's 3 years old. So the Rambam says you have to take that with a grain of salt. The Rambam in Hilchas Avodas Kachavim, the Rambam talks about Avram Avinu as being the first person to recognize, okay, in his generation, the one God, and it says how old was Avram when that happened? He was 40, according to the Rambam. Now, there are many Mefarshim of the Rambam say, well, where does the Rambam get that from? Maybe we'll ask Rabbi Bredowitz this question next week when he's back, if he knows where the Rambam gets it from. But he said it last week?
Yeah. I can't remember what he said, but he said it.
I'll have to go watch his shir now from last week, okay? But Baruch Shekavanti. Kitzer, Agadah are not necessarily meant to be taken literally. So when we read these stories, we hear some of these stories, it's what is the take home message for us? And I think what we saw together today, both from the Rebbe Yajikov, from Rav Kook, from Rav Shlomo Zalman, is an attempt to take some of these midrashim related to both the story of Noach and the stories of Chanukah, and take some of these Mamari Chazal and give us some food for thought for truly appreciating what it means. The Siyantav of Chanukah that we're going to look ahead to is really all about, and to appreciate that opportunity that we're given, as Rav Moshe Wilson said, as we mentioned, Chet Kohen, that for 8 days, every single member of the Jewish people becomes what? Becomes a proverbial Kohen. Those 8 days, it says Rav Moshe Wilson, we're being transported to the Beis HaMikdash, and we have the opportunity to feel that closeness, that oneness, to experience that light, that beauty, and everything we're longing for. Any other questions? Yes.
Also, Yosef is the same gematria as Antiochus.
Yes, sir.
156 Chotzer, and Yosef is really the symbol of Hanukkah because of its fight against assimilation.
Against assimilation, right? Right.
So we have this idea also with the purity of the oil. And
TORAH, it's all about TORAH, right? And the TORAH is not necessarily only halachically, because, like as your husband said astutely, as we know in the story itself, at least if we take that story at face value, it was unnecessary. But in terms of, if we take all these ideas that we've been sharing in terms of the Mamarei Chazal that give us the spiritual perspective, what were the Chashmonaim trying to accomplish? Not just to restore a halachically satisfactory reality, but what? To reignite that ruchnius within every single member of Klal Yisrael. And that's why we see them doing this l'chumra and not just mikra adin. Any other questions? Yeah.
You mean to tell us that the episode of Abraham breaking his idol and getting thrown into the furnace of King Nimrod are not historical facts?
They may not be historical facts. I didn't say they aren't, I said they may not be historical facts. Okay? Agadah needs to be looked at and understood as a message for us, lav dafka as factual. There are many other examples you could give of out there agadatot, okay, but we actually learned some of them together here in this course when I've taught here over the summer, but it's not for today. Any other questions? Yeah.
This, what we're still talking about now is that the Jewish people were able to take care of being against the countries that were against us. War mamash. You follow me?
Yeah.
So I think that was something new.
Well, maybe I'll drop one last idea that's not on the sheets. So to answer our question about the famous story of Chanukah and the story of the apocryphal Pach Hashem. Okay, this is you'll like this. Rivka, you'll like this. Rivka, you'll like this. Rivka, you will like this idea. So there's an alternate version of the story of Chanukah that appears in the Pesikta. Pesikta says that when the Chashmonaim came into the Beis Hamikdash and they were victorious over the Greeks, what did they find there? It doesn't say anything about searching and looking for a pach shemen, a cruse of oil. It says they found there shmona shipudei barzel. They found 8 iron spears there. They bound them together and they made a makeshift menorah. That's why the menorah that we light on Chanukah has 8 candles and not 7 candles, because they took these spears that the menorah had been destroyed and rendered impure, and they took these spears that they found laying in the Beis Hamikdash, and they made a makeshift candelabra that had 8 spears, 8 candlesticks instead of 7. And says with Tzedakah Hakanu V'Blin. Now, what do we learn from this? 2 things. Number one, the idea we know that one of the reasons why when we light candles, we light counting upwards is what? Ma'alim b'kodesh, the ema reading. The idea of ascending in holiness and sanctity and not descending. So he says, what better example could there be, says Ritzadak, of ascending in holiness, when they come into the Beis Hamikdash, they find the spoils of war. Okay, weapons that were used for destructive purpose originally, and they transform those vessels of destruction to what? To a temporary menorah, to become a kli for kedusha, to become a vehicle to bring holiness and light back into the world, back into the Beis Hamikdash, and back into the world. So says Tzedakah Hakanu V'Blin, the story of Chanukah is not as it appears word for word in the canon of the Gemara, but we have to look to this Pesikta, and it teaches us that what? That the Chashmonaim demonstrate that when there's a will, there's a way. Okay, that when the Chashmonaim come into the Beis Hamikdash, they see utter destruction, and they see there's no menorah, but they see laying there what? Swords. And they could have just thrown up their hands and said, it's finished. We lost the whole enterprise. But they didn't do that. They looked around. They saw the spoils of war. They put together a makeshift menorah, which now has 8 candles, which explains the idea of lighting 8 candles in 8 nights, not that the oil burned miraculously for 8 candles. Because again, in the Pesikta, the version of Pesikta, there's no mention of the miracle oil, right? It's just 8 spears. And says with Tzadok, this teaches us another fundamental and important message of Chanukah, associated with Chanukah, and that is what? The idea of ratzon. When a Jew demonstrates the ratzon, the desire to serve God, even in the darkest of moments, when we kind of make the first step forward in Shor HaKadosh Baruch Hu, our desire to serve Him, He will fill us up with light, says Rav Tzadok. My bracha for every single one of us, as we go to our coffee break, is that as we start to look ahead and start to think about Chanukah, we take all these ideas, these beautiful ideas to heart, and that we should indeed be blessed to Shor HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we do have the ratzon to come close to Him, and that He will in turn bless us to fill us up with light.